Hey, it's Marcel Petitpas here, CEO and co-founder at Parakeeto, and I want to thank you for tuning in to learn about agency profitability optimization. And in this video, we're going to go through essentially the 20% of information that you need to know in order to measure 80% or see 80% of what's going on in your business. And using these 4 metrics, you can really steer your business towards optimal profitability and to be able to do a lot of that without actually relying on your financial data at all. That means you don't have to wait till the end of the month until 3 weeks after the month is over, once your bookkeepers have finally gotten you your financial reports to understand if the business is healthy or not. You can start measuring this as often as daily and really start to, in a very inexpensive and efficient way, dig into the details of what areas of the business are or aren't performing with you. So we're going to go through all of that today, the metrics, the benchmarks, how to use them, and hopefully give you a simple framework that you can use to change the way you look at your business for the better. So I'm going to share my screen and we're going to dive in here. First and foremost, a little bit about me. I'm the CEO and co-founder at Parakeeto, where this is all we do. We help digital and creative agencies optimize their profitability. We help audit their businesses and showing them where they're losing profits and where they have opportunities to improve. We help them build and install systems to measure these KPIs, and they can even hire us to become their fractional data operations team. So we take care of running their reports and sitting down with them and helping them understand what's going on in the business and make better decisions every day. And if you want to hear more information about these topics, then you can tune into the Agency Profit podcast or check out our blog at Parakeeto, where we're constantly posting about the nuances of this kind of stuff. So let's just jump straight to it. You are in the right place if you don't have a clear vision or strategy when it comes to the metrics you use to measure your agency's profitability and performance. You might be struggling with messy tools and process. So when you do try to get an answer to a question, you find yourself spending way more time in a spreadsheet than you think you should. Maybe you're spending a lot of time cleaning up data, fixing mistakes, trying to get things to line up. Your estimate doesn't line up to your time tracking data, etc. If this is the case, then you're in the right place. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that. And finally, if you just find yourself guessing and stressing, making important decisions about projects, about people, but you feel like you just don't have information that you're basing those decisions on, then you're in the right place. What we're going to go through today is really establishing some clear metrics and benchmarks so that you can really boil things down to 4 simple numbers that will tell you everything you need to know about where your agency is headed. We'll give you some simple frameworks to generate repeatable outcomes with those numbers and repeatable insights. And then, of course, create alignment and predictability. So everyone on your team is focused on their same metrics. They're defining those metrics in the same way. And you can start to use those to look out into the future and model future scenarios as well. So with that, we're going to start with the highest level, which is your financials. So these are the 3 things we're going to cover today. We're going to cover financials, financial metrics, and we're really going to focus on the core financial metrics today. So what are the kind of essential things that you need to be able to measure? And then we're going to talk about your profitability levers. And these are non-financial metrics, and that's incredibly important because your financial metrics are going to be very precise, very detailed. However, they tend to be a little slow and they inevitably look backwards on the past. But what we want to be able to do is get snapshots much more often and look into the future. So we're going to talk about how to do that with profit levers, and then we're going to talk about scoping accuracy, which is all about how to get better at scoping work so that work is more profitable when it comes in, but then also how to plan the amount of time that it takes to do work in a more deliberate way so that you can scale your team and scale your operations and also, of course, protect your profit margins. So starting off, we're going to talk here about core financial metrics. So let's dive into it. At the fundamental level, how does an agency make money, and what are the measures of efficiency that you should be able to see on your profit and loss statement? And I want to share with you that we look at a lot of financial statements for a lot of agencies, and almost none of them, I can count on a single hand the amount of times that I've seen an agency properly measuring all of these metrics. So pay close attention, because if there's nothing else that you get from this video, you can walk away today and go speak to your accountant or your bookkeeper and get them to start measuring things in this way. And I promise you that alone will be worth the time investment and will help you uncover lots of opportunity. So The first thing that you, of course, need to be measuring is your revenue. If your accounting team is not getting that right, then you have a pretty substantial problem. This should be as easy as it gets. This is all of the money that comes into your business. This might also be called income, right? Revenue, income, whatever you want to call that. This is all the money that comes into the business. But what we want to be able to isolate from revenue is what we call our AGI, which stands for agency gross income. And so what is the difference between revenue and AGI? The difference is that we have to subtract out what we call pass-through expenses. And so this may be a factor for you. If you run an agency, it might not. But if you run, for example, digital ads, and you pay the ad spend on behalf of your clients, you collect the money from them, and then you spend the money to run the ads. Or, for example, you collect print budgets from clients, and then you go and spend the money on print. Or, for example, if you run paid media, but you don't do video production in-house. However, you manage video production on behalf of clients, and you hire an external firm to produce ads for you. You use white label partners. You buy hard goods in order to deliver stuff to clients. These are all examples of pass-through expenses where you're collecting income from the client, but you're not actually responsible for the profitability of that income or for earning that income, for lack of a better word, with your own time and internal resources that are passing through you onto external vendors. So we want to be able to isolate those costs and get some clarity on how much is left over, which leaves us with AGI, agency gross income. This is a critically important number because this is the true revenue of our agency as it relates to measuring profitability and efficiency. And it's especially important because we don't want to be making spending decisions on things like overhead and payroll based on an inflated, potentially very inflated value of revenue or income when it's not actually the case. And a parallel to this would be, for example, Airbnb. If Airbnb counted their income and made spending decisions based on the total amount of money that flowed through their transaction system every month, then they would think that they were substantially bigger, about 75 or 85% bigger than they actually are. The reality is Airbnb's actual income, or AGI in this case, is the 15% cut or 20% cut. I don't know what their percentage is now, but the cut that they take of every reservation, that's the size of their business. The other 80% of that money is flowing through them onto the people who are actually renting out their home. Right? That belongs to them. So you want to kind of think about the same dynamic that might be occurring in your business and make sure you isolate AGI. Now, for most of you, your AGI might actually be calculated on your profit and loss statement today, but it's going to be called something like gross profit. And your accountant might be using your cost of goods sold area to calculate this. They might also be using a negative income line. So perhaps your income or total income is reflective of your AGI. It all depends on how your accountant is isolating these things. And it's very possible that they're not properly isolating these things. So that's the first thing that you want to address. From there, we have to ask ourselves the question, what is our gross margin on AGI, or what is our margin on AGI? And this is where we want to isolate our delivery profit. Our delivery profit is after we have finished the work that we promised to clients, how much money is left over, right? And really what we want to isolate here is our delivery costs. Right? What are our delivery costs? And our delivery costs are generally going to be mostly labor, right? So of all the people that we have on our team, what percentage of that payroll is allocated towards doing client work? So maybe we have 5 full-time employees. 3 of them are just designers, copywriters, developers. Their whole job is to do work for clients. So 100% of their salary is allocated. Then we have an admin assistant. They're 100% admin. So none of their salary is allocated to this. And then as a founder, maybe I spend 25% of my time doing client work. So 25% of my salary is allocated to delivery costs. And then what also might be included here would be things like, we have a Figma subscription. We pay for Adobe Creative Cloud. We have some other tools that we use to deliver stuff to clients, but they're not just for a single project. These are kind of tools in our tool belt. All of that would go into delivery costs. So we want to make sure that we are able to isolate that on our profit and loss statement. And where most agencies are going wrong on this is when we look at their accounts, they have all their payroll just going to one big bucket, and they have all their software expenses, for example, going into one big bucket. So to figure out what their delivery profit is, they need to go into the transaction level and do manual math, and it's really just kind of time consuming. So super, super easy to just say, hey, let's just split that out and let's isolate how much of our payroll, how much of our software, how much of our other costs are delivery costs. And what we will be left here with is a delivery margin. Delivery margin. And generally what we want is for this delivery margin to be above 50% on our profit and loss statement. So what that means is for every dollar that a client pays us, we want to spend no more than 50 cents to earn that dollar, to complete the work that the client has asked us to do. We want it to cost us less than 50 cents for every dollar. And finally, what that's going to leave us to cover afterwards is our overhead. Overhead. And overhead is generally going to be somewhere between 20 to 30% of our agency gross income. And generally what that breaks down into is sales and marketing at anywhere from 8 to 14%, admin at anywhere from 8 to 14%, and facilities, usually anywhere from 4 to 6%. Now, these ranges down here, the 8 to 14, 8 to 4, these are big ranges, and frankly, I don't want you to place too much weight on them. What's important is that you have the ability to get your overhead spending into this 20 to 30% of AGI range. And if you, for example, run a remote team and you don't spend much on facilities, you might choose to spend more money on sales and marketing or more money on admin. All that's totally fine as long as your overhead is reasonably balanced relative to your agency gross income. You should be in a good position to make a profit. So assuming that you have a 50% plus delivery margin and you're spending 20 to 30% of your agency gross income on overhead, then that should leave you with an operating profit. This is often referred to as EBITDA, of anywhere from 20 to 30%, which is really where you want to end up. So if you're not here right now, pay attention, because we're going to talk about how to get yourself to this range or even higher as an agency. Now, the reason that most of our clients struggle with figuring out if they're profitable or why they're profitable, most often what they're trying to figure out is why they're not as profitable as they'd like to be, is because they tend to only have visibility really into revenue and operating profit. And all this stuff in the middle is kind of jumbled together in their books. And so for that reason, they're not really sure which of these things is the problem. Right? Why aren't we as profitable as we need to be? And so what they tend to start to focus on is trying to reduce their overhead costs. And we very rarely see agencies with inflated overhead costs relative to the size of their team. Generally, the problem is that their delivery margin is not high enough. There's a poor relationship here between the cost that they incur on their delivery team and the AGI that team is able to produce. So that's where we really want to focus. And if there's nothing else that you take away from this, I hope that it's measuring delivery margin as an outcome. This is the most important metric that you can measure for the profitability of your business. Without visibility on delivery margin, you are effectively flying blind and relying on the bottom line to tell you if things are going well or not. And you have really no indication of how fundamentally profitable your work is. You can see how profitable the business is, but there's a big difference between the business being profitable or unprofitable and your work being fundamentally profitable or unprofitable. And most of the time what we find is that there is a systemic issue with the fundamental profitability of the work, meaning that when you sell work, it is not generating a good amount of profit that actually improves the health of the business. And so another way to put that is most agencies think they're suffering from starvation, but what they're actually experiencing is indigestion. They just happen to feel the same when you're looking at the bottom line. So let's talk about the 3 levers now to improve your agency's profit. So we'll skip over this for a moment. We've talked about core financials. The next thing that we want to do now is talk about our margin levers. What are the 3 ways that we can actually influence this number? So If we think about delivery margin, the formula for delivery margin is quite simple. We have our agency gross income, AGI, minus our delivery costs, divided by agency gross income. So if we ran through an example of this, if I had an agency that did, for example, $1 million in agency gross income, and I spent $400,000 on payroll and tools for my delivery team, then I would have, in this case, a 60% delivery margin. All right, that's the math. Pretty straightforward. Now, what are the two things that we can do then, looking at this formula, to improve our delivery margin? Well, we can earn more agency gross income and keep our delivery costs where they are or increasing at a slower rate. Or we can do the inverse. We can keep our agency gross income where it is, and we can decrease our delivery costs. So let's talk about the levers that we have at our disposal in order to achieve those outcomes. So if we think about delivery margin at the center of this triangle, what are the three peaks? Well, we have average cost per hour, and this is really how we think about lowering our delivery costs. So if you can imagine, you have a senior resource. That senior resource costs $100,000 per year to employ because they're fairly experienced. They have good technical skills. And currently, you have a deliverable in your agency that requires 100% of that person's time to complete. So all of the work has to be done by that person because it's very technical and it requires a lot of skill. Now imagine that you can create better process documentation, maybe develop some tools, streamline your operations such that now 50% of the work on that deliverable can be done by a more junior resource that only costs $50,000 per year to employ. At scale, what you've effectively been able to do there is cut your average cost per hour by 25%. So moving that average cost per hour down over time can mean that your delivery costs can be decreased. And if you are working with freelancers in the early days of your agency, you will feel this very, very directly. If you can now all of a sudden cut the amount of time you need from a more expensive person down and then give that to a person that's less expensive, then you're effectively decreasing your delivery costs. And ideally what that means is that you're not changing the price of the thing that is being delivered, and therefore you are improving your margin as a result. Now, the other side of the equation is how do we get our current team to improve the amount of AGI that they can generate without having to change our cost structure? And there's two ways to achieve that. The first is average billable rate, and the second is utilization. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about each of these metrics and kind of what they mean and digging into this. So let's kind of keep going here on average cost per hour. So the first thing that we want to talk about on average cost per hour is the formula. So what is somebody's average cost per hour? Well, it's their total compensation divided by their capacity. So let's talk about what this means. Total compensation divided by their capacity. So what goes into total compensation is a question that I often get. And their total compensation is going to be their salary plus any of the benefits that they receive as being an employee in the company. So we want to factor in things like if they're getting a 401k match, they're getting dental, they're getting medical benefits, they're getting a stipend for home office equipment, things of that nature. We want to factor all of those things into their total compensation. And then in terms of capacity, we really want to look at this as being their total capacity in a given period of time. So for most people, this is 40 hours per week multiplied by 52 weeks per year, or 2,080 hours. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, I don't actually get 2,080 hours out of an employee. They get vacation time, they get holidays, we give them maybe some other paid time off. We probably have some internal, training days or days that we do annual planning or quarterly planning, and all of that is very true. But what we don't want to do is remove that from this calculation, because then it will become inconsistent with this entire framework that we've developed. We are going to consider the cost of that time off, but we'll talk about that in our utilization calculation. That's where we want to factor it in. And this is, I think, a moment where I want to explain a very important concept, which is precision versus accuracy. and how oftentimes when we see agencies trying to measure their metrics in their agency, they become obsessed with making that metric very precise, even when it doesn't improve the accuracy of that metric. And sometimes it actually decreases the accuracy of that metric. And cost per hour is one of those places where trying to make this metric too precise, too early, means that there's a dramatic increase in the complexity of measuring average cost per hour that is then dispersed in a lot of different places in the system for measuring profitability. And it increases the amount of work that's required, the amount of time that's required, the amount of inputs that are required to get this building block that is used all over the system. And those inputs change frequently. So we don't want to ignore the cost of time off, the cost of holidays, etc., but we want to factor it in at the right time and the right place so that the changes that are occurring and the complexity that that brings to this system is not being brought in too early and then creating a ton of extra work that we have to deal with all the time and all over the place. So hopefully that's making sense. And again, for the project managers in the room that are watching, I understand you're detail oriented, and this is the first thing, the red flag that goes off. We will consider the cost of that time, but for this calculation, when you're calculating somebody's average cost per hour, you want to look at total compensation over capacity. And this metric scales to groups of people all the way down to individual people. So that is how we calculate that number. And again, when we look at a project, we can then start to understand, okay, who worked on this? How many hours did they work? What was our average cost per hour for this project? Or if we look at a team, we can start to measure this and start to get a sense of how does that average cost per hour go up or down as the skill level or seniority or type of resource that's required to complete things goes up or goes down. So to show you an example of this, if I have a strategist at 120K and 2,008 hours per year, their average cost per hour is about $57.69. If I'm trying to target a 70% margin on my average billable rate, which we'll talk about in a moment, then we want to be on average making $192 for every hour that that person works in order for us to achieve that margin. If we have an intern that is that costs us $55,000 and again has 2,080 hours a year of capacity, their average cost per hour is $26.44. That means that we only need to actually be averaging $88.13 per hour to hit our 70% margin target. And if we blend those two together, our average cost per hour is $42, which means about $140 average billable rate in order to hit our target. So you can see here that if we were employing a strategist and a strategist had to do all of the work on a deliverable, we'd have to have a pretty high average billable rate in order to hit our 70% margin. Now, if we're able to achieve that average billable rate, but then decrease our average cost per hour to 42 by having half of the work be done by the intern, then all we're really doing here is increasing our margin. So thumbs up to that. That's what we want to be pursuing most of the time. So that is average cost per hour, our first key lever. The next thing that I want to talk about is average billable rate, right? This is the next side of the equation, average billable rate. Actually, I'm going to move it over here for continuity. So let's talk about average billable rate. What is it? What does it mean? It's not the rate that you charge clients per se. It's the rate that you earn after you look at what was accomplished and how much time it took. So the formula for average billable rate is how much AGI was earned in a given period of time divided by the number of delivery hours that were required to earn that AGI. So this metric scales from a single project. It could even go down to a deliverable within a project or a task within a project. To whatever level of fidelity you can isolate your agency gross income and your delivery hours, you can measure this metric. And essentially, what this allows us to understand is what is the earning efficiency of our team. For every hour that they work, on average, how much revenue does that earn for the business? So I want to make a couple of things clear here. We talked about the definition of agency gross income before. So remember that this means stripping out pass-through expenses at whatever level you're doing this at, if it's for a department, if it's for a specific project, if it's for the whole agency, and for a given period of time. And then delivery hours is the more important one. What is a delivery hour? Well, you might call this a billable hour. We don't call it a billable hour because we want to make it clear that it doesn't matter if the client was technically billed for the hour or not. So where this becomes different than a billable hour is in a case where you have a billable project and you're billing by the hour. You might bill the client for 100 hours, even though it took you 120 to complete the work. So what we want to factor in here is the 120 hours that it actually took to complete the work, because that's the true hourly rate that you earned on this project. So delivery hours are defined as any amount of time that's required to move that project forward. And it doesn't matter if they were billed to the client, if they were, tracked in some other way. The only thing that matters is what did you get paid and how much time did it take you to get the work done. And there is no consideration here about the contract structure, the mechanics of the contract. This applies to flat rate, value-based, hourly, Trident layers, whatever billing model you've got with the client. This applies to that, and it scales vertically and horizontally, meaning it can scale from the smallest possible object within a project that you can isolate these two metrics at, all the way up to the agency as a whole. And then you can look at this on a daily basis if you can accrue your revenue that quickly and track your time that quickly. And you could look at this over a 10-year time horizon. So that's average billable rate. And again, the two levers that you can pull here to improve your average billable rate is number one, the one that we all love to talk about, which is increase your prices, right? Just charge more money without changing the scope, or without changing the scope in equivalent amount, right? And spend the same amount of time, but just charge more money for the same thing. But of course, when we start to run into the very real ceilings that exist with pricing increases, the other option that we have is find a way to spend less time to do the same work. And there's lots of ways that you can spend less time to do the same work. Create templates, create better process, invest in tools, invest in automation. There's all kinds of levers that we can use here to try and decrease the time it takes us to do things. And by doing so, we increase our average billable rate. So to give you an example of this, if I had a project where I was making $15,000 in agency gross income, so if I had 15K here, and I spent 100 delivery hours on that project, my average billable rate would be $150. Now, if I spent on that same project only 50 hours to complete the project, then I would have an average billable rate of $300. And where this starts to matter is when you think about you have a certain amount of capacity. Oh, I didn't realize my face was in the way there. Sorry. So in the first example, we have a $15,000 project divided by 100 hours. That's $150 an hour. In the second case, we have 50 hours, and that's $300 an hour. So if you really think about your business, if you have 5 employees, they all have 2,080 hours per year of capacity, and you can sell that capacity for more money on average per hour, then you can increase the delivery margin of the business. So in this case, if I've decreased the time it takes me to do this work, I have 2 choices. I can fire half my team. That decreases my delivery costs. I've just doubled my margin. Or I can sell twice as much work without having to hire anybody, and that can also increase my delivery margin. So this is a critically important metric. And the other thing that's powerful about this is it can help you start to compare things, compare clients, compare projects, compare departments, compare types of work, products, services, and start to get an understanding of where you're averaging a higher average billable rate or a lower average billable rate. And if you understand your average cost per hour from earlier, you can run the same delivery margin formula here, but instead of doing it with these metrics, you would use your ABR and your average cost per hour. And this would be ABR. And this will give you an estimate on your delivery margin. So you could run this, again, at the project, client, department level for any time period, any subsection of the business where you have this information, and start to get a sense of where you're making the most margin. And the beautiful thing about this is you don't need financial statements for any of this. All you need to know is how much you charge the client and then how much time it took you. So this is fast, it's cheap, and it's extremely effective at starting to get insight into what's going on in the business on tighter time horizons. So an example of this, just to kind of put the rubber to the road, let's say we got a website that we got paid $70,000 for, but we had $20,000 in pass-through costs. Maybe we paid an outsourced development team to build it and we just did the design. Our agency gross income in this case is going to be $50,000. And if we spent 500 hours to do the work and manage this project, then we had an average billable rate of $100 per hour. Next up, we have a brand design project where we had $20,000 in income and we had a $15,000 AGI, but we only spent 100 hours on this, so we had a $150 ABR. And then we have this funnel build. It's kind of a dark horse. We only had $10,000 in AGI, but look, we did it in 50 hours. So that gives us a $200 per hour ABR. And when we total all of this up, we could see that our blended weighted average billable rate is $115 per hour. So this is an example of how you would use this metric in a report. And what I would encourage you to do is have a conversation about the outliers. What can we do to make websites more efficient? And what can we learn about our funnel builds that we might be able to reverse engineer into the rest of our business and increase our average billable rate elsewhere? Or maybe we should just be selling more funnel builds. All right. So let's talk finally about the last lever, which is utilization. Save the best for last. Utilization to me is the most misunderstood metric in the agency world. It's the most dangerous metric when not used properly. So let's talk about what utilization is and what it means and how it applies to this system. Utilization at its most fundamental level is the number of delivery hours worked in a given period of time for a given section of the team. So again, like the other metrics, this scales horizontally and vertically. You can look at an individual person, a group of people, a department, a team, or the whole agency, and you can look at them for any period of time for which you have delivery hours and capacity calculated. So capacity is the other side of this equation. And what this measures is the amount of time that we have purchased that is actually used for earning revenue, or in other words, sold for the average billable rate that we've calculated elsewhere. So our capacity, again, is all of the time we have available. For most people, this is 2,080 hours a year. And our delivery hour, we've already defined. This is any time spent working for clients, again, regardless if it was technically billed to them or not, which is not a relevant topic for the purpose of utilization. I want to pause here and say that this is the purely financial and profitability focused way of measuring utilization. There are other ways of measuring utilization for other purposes and for answering other questions that you might see employed in your agency, but I think it's important to make sure that it's clear that these are different and they serve a different purpose. So other versions of utilization that we sometimes see would be billable utilization, whereby we're trying to measure the amount of hours in a given amount of capacity that were billed to the client. So you might say, well, how much of our capacity was spent in billable hours, which again is maybe different than delivery hours in a certain case. You also have these delivery utilization type metrics where instead of looking at the total capacity, you're trying to get a sense of, well, what was the available capacity in a given period of time? And that's where you would do things like strip out vacation time, holidays, paid time off, etc. And those are generally used to measure other things, productivity, how well the project management team is doing at utilizing the available hours that are available to them, resource planning efficiency. But if you think about those as a way to try and measure profitability, they are not going to do a good job of that, simply because, well, if we look at delivery utilization, for example, if we are decreasing our capacity based on holidays, paid time off, sick days, time that's not available, non-billable time, then based on that calculation, the less capacity we have, or in other words, the more holidays, non-billable time, vacation time that the team takes, the more profitable we become as a business. And of course, we know that that's not true. So we can't use that metric to answer this question of how is utilization contributing to our profitability, but it's totally fine to have alternate versions of utilization to answer alternate questions. So with that in mind, let's talk about really what it means to move utilization and how we influence this number. So keeping in mind that it's delivery hours over capacity. If we are in this situation where we have a certain amount of capacity and we have a certain amount of delivery hours planned in a given period of time, and our target is here, and we are going to miss our target. We have this gap here that needs to be closed. what are the two levers that we have available to us to close that gap? Well, the first lever is we can decrease capacity, right? The other lever is that we can increase billable hours. And in doing one of those two things, we can close our utilization gap and get to target. Now, here's the catch. If we just ask the team to spend more time working on the same amount of work, we might see our utilization go up. But if we remember from before, our calculation for average billable rate, it depended on delivery hours. Our average billable rate is going to go down. So that does not benefit our profitability. And in fact, it's going to hurt us more than it's going to help us, because then our clients just get used to being overserviced and our team starts to get used to spending more time than is necessary to complete things. And so what we actually want to do to increase utilization is give our team more work to do, right? This is not accomplished with busyness. This is accomplished with resource planning. It's accomplished with sales. It's accomplished by balancing capacity and utilization, or delivery hours, I should say. So when you think about it this way, this is why I want to make it clear that I don't think utilization is a metric that should be put in front of most of your team. It's a management metric. It's maybe a project management metric, but your designers, developers, copywriters that are doing work every single day, there's no reason for them to have a target for utilization, because it's just not going to drive the right behaviors, and it's frankly not something that is their responsibility or is within their control. This is your responsibility as a management team. This utilization metric really measures your competency at balancing your staffing with the amount of sales that you bring in and making decisions about resource planning, forecasting, hiring, managing the elasticity of your team and how many contractors you keep around as opposed to hiring full-time employees. Your employees don't get to decide how much work you put in front of them. That's your responsibility to sell enough work, to make it clear who's assigned to what, and to take on that part of running the business. So if you find yourself putting utilization targets in front of your team, I would encourage you to really rethink that practice and understand that it's probably hurting your agency more than it's helping it, unless there's only one exception to this: you only bill by the hour and clients always pay for all the hours that you bill them. If that's not the case, this is probably not a useful tactic, and it's probably actually just leading to really incorrect and untruthful hours in your time tracking system or over-servicing of your clients with no benefit to your profitability whatsoever. So with that in mind, let's talk about how you would run a utilization report. A quick example, we have Brett and Janine, who both work full-time. Brett had 100 delivery hours in a time period, so he was 62% utilized. Janine was 120 hours, so that's 75%. And Rochelle is part-time. She has 80 hours of capacity, and she was 62% utilized with 50 hours. And as a team, we landed at 67.5%. So I get asked about benchmarks around this a lot, and there's a lot of individual benchmarks, and I'll talk to them, but they're not quite as important as these bottom ones. So on a weekly basis, you generally want your team to be able to achieve a 65% utilization or higher, and as an agency as a whole, over an annual basis, to be at 50% or higher. If you can achieve this with a reasonable industry average billable rate, you should be able to be profitable. Now, the composition of that can vary dramatically. And some agencies, I see their utilization floor being higher to 60 or 65%, sometimes even as high as 70%. When they don't have much management, they don't have much administration or overhead, and a lot of their team is made up of pure producers who have very high annual targets or weekly targets. So on a pure producer level, generally we're seeing targets anywhere from 75 to up to 90%. And keep in mind that the targets that we're going to set for pure producers, and when I say a pure producer, I mean a designer, a developer, a copywriter, somebody whose full-time job is doing work for clients, is moving client deliverables forward. Those pure producers, typically we're expecting anywhere from 28 to, on the high end, 36, maybe very high end, 38 hours of billable time from them per week. And the big determinant on how high that ceiling goes comes down to client dilution. If they get to focus on a single client for weeks at a time, their utilization tends to be higher. But if they have to bounce around to many different client projects and tasks, then their utilization tends to be lower. And then there's also the consideration of how much time you're asking them to spend doing things that are not billable. That would include things like filling in timesheets, but of course also sitting into internal meetings, being involved in internal process, etc. Delivery managers, this would be the folks that oversee the delivery team. So this might be like a creative director, or it might be a senior or VP of engineering, or it might be the head of delivery. They are probably also going to spend some time working for clients, but really anything over 35% to me is kind of a bonus. And then you'll have other people in the agency that are not billable at all. Your sales team, your admin assistant, maybe yourself as the owner are not billable at all. And that's okay. We don't want to exclude those people from our calculations for capacity. We want to include them. But what's important at the end of the day is that as an agency, at the end of the year, if everybody hits their targets, we should be able to get up over 50%. If we can't, it's not necessarily the end of the world, but what that means is we're going to have a higher than usual average billable rate in order to still come out as a profitable agency. And you'll see in a moment how that works out. So I get asked sometimes about, 4-day work week. Should I do that as an agency? Is it possible? Of course, it's possible, but somebody has to pay for it. And ideally, it's going to be your client. So let's talk about how to make that work. So let's bring these things together. Let's imagine that in a given agency, we have 10,000 hours of capacity. So this would be about 5 full-time employees. If we are utilizing them at 50% and we have an average billable rate of $100 per hour, then this agency can earn $500,000 in a given period of time. So let's assume in this case that this team costs $300,000 in payroll. Right? So in this case, this agency is going to have a $200,000 profit or delivery profit, $200,000 delivery profit. And sorry, my mug is in the way again. Right? So if they have a $300,000 cost, we have a $200,000 delivery profit. We do the math on that, $200,000 divided by $500,000, or 2 divided by 5. We just want to get really simple about this. Is going to be 40%. So at 500K, 40% delivery margin, that is not very good. Assuming that we're going to spend 20 to 30% of our agency gross income on overhead, we might squeeze out, 10, 15, if we're lucky, 20% profit margin on the year. But if anything goes wrong here, if we have a dip in utilization, we miss our ABR target, we have to hire an additional person, then we could end up, with little to no profit. So this is an okay business, but it's not necessarily going to be a very healthy one. And certainly there's no certainty around profitability. Now, what if we just make a simple tweak? We keep the team exactly where it is. We don't change the payroll structure, but we can get our utilization now up to 60% on an annual basis. Our average billable rate stays exactly the same. Now this business can earn $600,000. And assuming that the cost of the team has stayed the same, our delivery margin has now increased to 50%. So we're in a better position here for sure, right? If we spend 20 to 30% of our AGI on overhead, then we're likely to actually have a pretty healthy profit margin. But we're high performers, so we want to push this even further. And the way that we would achieve that would be maybe looking at average billable rate and saying, can we find a way to get more efficient in how we do some work, maybe make a couple pricing changes here and there, and we get this up to $125 an hour. Now this same business with the same team, the same cost, can earn $750,000 in AGI. So $750,000 minus our $300,000 team cost is a $450,000 delivery profit, which equates to a delivery margin of 60%. And now all of a sudden we're in position to do 30 to 40% EBITDA, or we can make the decision to reinvest back into the business. Let's spend more on sales and marketing. Let's spend more on admin. Let's grow the team. Let's drive faster growth because we have a cash engine here that's really, really efficient. So you could see here that these small tweaks in these simple metrics, utilization and average billable rate, can have a really big impact on the efficiency of the business. So we've talked here about core financials, and we've talked about our efficiency levers, our delivery margin levers. The last thing that I want to spend just a moment on is scoping accuracy. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this. And we have more resources, of course, available to you at Parakeeto to talk about scoping accuracy, but I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention it. Most of the metrics that I talked about, and when you start to think about using these to forecast into the future, they require you to be able to predict to some extent what it's going to take to deliver work to clients. So if we're pricing our engagements and we're trying to get to a certain delivery margin or we're trying to get to a certain average billable rate, which we absolutely should be when we price a project. We should know what our average billable rate is going to be or what we're planning for it to be. And we should know what the delivery margin that represents for us should be. And we should generally be targeting anywhere from 10 to 15% more than what our target is on the P&L. So for example, if we want to make a 50% delivery margin on our profit and loss statement, we should be pricing our projects at least a 60% delivery margin when we put the price in front of the client based on our estimates. But all of that just kind of is a wash if our estimates aren't accurate and we end up spending twice as much time as we thought on things consistently. Of course, our margins are going to be dramatically worse and we're probably not going to end up on the right side of the profit line. So scoping accuracy is important. So how do you improve it? Well, there's a model that we like to talk about here, which is the agency profitability flywheel. And it's how we use the metrics we just talked about to actually facilitate a process by which the team becomes involved in improving our efficiency as a business. And so it starts with estimates, right? We've got to estimate how much time it's going to take. And then we have actuals. And that comes from, of course, measuring time and comparing it to estimates, measuring average billable rates and comparing them to estimates, measuring delivery margins, comparing them to estimates. And the biggest thing here is creating structural alignment. Right? So if you estimate time by role, by how many design hours, delivery hours, design hours, copywriting hours, project management hours, et cetera, if that's what your estimates look like, but then we go into your time tracking tool and it's 200 random tasks that don't have any indication of which one of those role categories they belong to, then it's going to be really hard for you to figure out where was our estimate off. Other than maybe just at the project level. So you want to make sure that there's a structural alignment between how you estimate things and how you track things so that answering those questions and getting into more detail about where things are going off the rails is a lot easier to do. And then what you're able to do is sit down and run reports and meetings with your team where you look at the outliers, what went better than expected and what went worse than expected. And that leads to process improvements, which over time should mean that the amount of time that's required to do things becomes more predictable because the process for doing that thing becomes more standardized. And this feedback loop is generally what tightens up scopes of work over time. Now, there's one other consideration here, though, which is, well, what if the work that we're doing is just incredibly risky and every project that we work on is completely different, or the methodology we have to use in order to do this work is not conducive to estimation at all? For example, we have to use the Agile methodology to build effective solutions for our clients. And as you know, you can't really estimate the Agile methodology, or at least it's kind of difficult to estimate how much time it's going to take in the Agile methodology, because the whole point of it is we do a sprint, we learn something, and then based on those learnings, we plan the next sprint, right? So it could take 5 sprints to do this thing. It could take 50 sprints. Well, the way that you think about that is really with the pricing model quadrant. So really quickly, there are 4 ways to price, and you want to align your pricing model to the risk of that project. So you want to think about what is the value, right? And this is high value, this is low value to the client. And value generally comes down to how many other options does the client have? Is my positioning basically very specific? If I said, for example, that I do graphic design work, well, that's going to be a low value service. Everybody does graphic design work. If I Google that, I get a lot of results. But if I say, hey, I help B2B SaaS companies visually communicate complex data systems using design, I'm still doing graphic design, but I'm solving a much more specific problem. So my positioning is putting me into a smaller category, and I'm giving the client fewer options to compare me to. And similarly, we want to consider the complexity or the severity of the issue and the scale of that impact of solving that issue for the client. So if I improve the conversion rate on a website by 1%, is that good or is it bad? What is it worth? Well, it depends on how much revenue that website generates every month. 1% of $10,000 is not very interesting, but 1% of $10 million might be much more interesting. So consider the value of a service offering. And then secondly, the thing that we don't really consider that often is risk. Is this a low risk or a high risk project? right? So low risk would be generally we can get to within 10% of our estimate on a regular basis. And we know this because we have data, right? We've done it before. We measured how much time it takes. We know that the variance here is low, and we have the information from the client to make sure that we get there. So this is, when we start to get into productization, we start to get into specialization, we have a process, we have data, we have maturity. This is a low risk engagement. But then we might also have instances where we have high risk. And this is where we can't really get to a good estimate, or the estimate has a lot of risk around it because we've never done it before, we've never seen this problem before, or the circumstances, the scope, right? Something is unclear, and that is a different scenario. So in an event where we have low value, high risk, this is typically we want to bill hourly. And the reason we want to bill hourly is because, well, we're charging by the hour. So it doesn't really matter how much time it takes to complete this work because we're getting paid by the hour. Now, of course, we might still have to provide an estimate to the client, but we can provide it in a range, and we can provide that based on a set of information that they gave us so that contractually, as that information changes or as their requests change or as the scope changes, we can go back to them and say, hey, this is a deviance from the assumptions that we made when we gave you this quote, and it's going to increase the number of hours likely that's going to take. But the contract is they're paying you for your time. So again, as long as your average cost per hour is significantly lower than your billable rate and enough to create a 60 or 70% margin, then you're good. And if anybody has ever tried to tell you that you can't run a profitable, scalable, or successful agency billing hourly, that's mathematically incorrect. You absolutely can, as long as the margin between your average cost per hour and your average billable rate is sufficient. So you can use hourly contract models to share risk with the client. And in cases where there's low value, ideally you have a low cost per hour because low value typically would infer that there is a low amount of skill required. It's a fairly commoditized service, low amount of specialization. And so you can actually create the perception of value by having a low rate, right? Because it might cost $10,000 to complete something. But if you say, well, we charge $40 per hour, that sounds like a really good deal, even if it's going to take $10,000 worth of hours to complete the thing. It might sound like a better deal than saying it's $10,000. So I know it's a little nefarious, but this is actually something that I've seen work really well for clients that are selling commoditized services deliberately. They're going into that market to compete, and they found a way to get low-cost talent, and therefore they can create the perception of value with a low hourly rate. And again, they insulate themselves from risk by having an hourly billing model. Now, the flip side of that is you have high-value services that are also high risk. In this case, we want to start to look at abstracted time and materials. And really what this is it's adding a level of abstraction to selling hours. So instead of having the hourly conversation, we're selling some abstracted version of that. The most common version of this is selling agile, selling sprints, right? So we're going to sell you a 2-week sprint with a cross-functional team. So within that team, you have a full-time developer, a half a designer, a quarter of an architect, a half a project manager, and that team costs you $20,000 per sprint. And we estimate that it's going to take between 20 and 30 sprints to complete the backlog that you've given us. And if the client wants to ask for additional things, the answer is always yes, and we'll just add another sprint to complete those things. And yes, and do you want that before or after the other things that are already in the backlog? And it really becomes a team leasing model. And again, we can use the fact that it's a high value engagement to abstract the conversation away from the hour to higher buckets, larger buckets of work, larger units of time that allow us to increase our margin and ideally allow us to increase our average rate, but we're selling time still. So we are able to still create some risk sharing in the contract model with the client. And the beautiful thing about this is this is exactly how, if you've ever wondered how Design Pickle makes any money selling unlimited, air quotes, graphic design for $400 a month, it's because they're using abstracted time materials. What you buy when you spend $400 a month with them is a certain portion of a designer. And if you ask for 1 million deliverables, they will do all 1 million of those deliverables, but the millionth one might take 10 years to get to you. And they'll start reaching out to you when they see you asking for a lot of deliverables and say, hey, if you want to get these faster, you can just pay more money. And that increases the amount of resource that's allocated to your backlog and therefore the speed at which that backlog gets achieved. So abstracted time materials, great for high risk engagements. And then when we have low risk, this is typically when we see flat fees, and then value-based pricing, which are ultimately the simplest form, flat fees, but they're based on value. So instead of saying, I'm going to charge you $5,000 for this website, you could say, well, what's the website worth to you in terms of impact? Oh, it's going to add $1 million. Well, what about 10% of $1 million, right? And we're anchoring the price to the value as opposed to the deliverable. So that's the key difference between value-based and flat fees. But value-based does evolve as you go further down the low risk path and you start to de-risk not only the scope, but also the outcome to the client. You can go to performance-based, where you're being paid for the results, the output that your process generates. But again, this requires a high level of maturity in your service offering. You have to have, generally some empirical, repeatable evidence that when you put a certain amount of cost into a client in terms of time, effort, etc., you are able to produce a certain outcome, and therefore you can run the economics of that and allow yourself to capture more of the value that's created by taking on more of the risk. And really what we're doing here is we're arbitraging risk, and when we have high value, we're arbitraging value. So that is essentially the kind of last piece around scoping accuracy is if you can't actually scope something, well, set up your contract model so the only thing you have to scope is the units of time. And in this case, if you know that, okay, well, we're allocating a full-time resource to this person, or this is the team composition and we're allocating it to the client for this many weeks, then you don't have to actually scope the entire engagement necessarily. You only have to scope the individual pieces as they come up and the amount of team that's being allocated. And it really helps to streamline the operations and reduce the amount of friction that's caused by high risk or uncertain work. And then, of course, in these cases, you would typically have the information to scope things up front. And again, both of those things are going to allow you to scale the operations side, the resource planning, the forecasting of how much work needs to be done, and then contrast that to your capacity, which then gives you the ability to look into the future and forecast the profitability of the business. So I've covered a lot in today's training, and hopefully you found it all very helpful. And there's so much more to go through, as you can see in the sidebar of my slides here, but we don't have time for that today. What I want to encourage you to do is to check out our free toolkit here, which is full of more training resources. It's got templates, spreadsheets, all kinds of things to help you calculate these metrics for yourself. And of course, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me. My name is Marcel, and you can find me on LinkedIn. You can fire me an email if you have questions. And of course, check out parakeeto.com if you're interested in working with us to help you measure these metrics in your own agency. So with that, thank you so much for watching, and enjoy the rest of the presentations. Cheers.